To anyone else, the man and his dog were just another piece of the decay that haunted the forgotten shipyard. Jack, a man hollowed out by a past he could no longer outrun, sat on the splintered pier, the salt-laced wind doing little to scour the stale taste of despair from his mouth. Beside him, his German shepherd, Major, sat with the rigid posture of a palace guard, his gaze fixed not on his master, but on the hulking, rusted carcass of a ferry listing in the greasy water. To the world, Jack was a ghost, and the ferry was scrap metal, but the dog, with an intuition that bordered on the supernatural, knew it was the tomb of a $200 million secret, a secret that had already killed once and would try to kill again. Thank you for joining us for this story. If our work brings you value, please consider supporting us by subscribing to the channel. We'd also love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're in. The silence of the shipyard was a heavy blanket, muffling the world and Jack's own will to live. For 6 months since the phone call that had shattered his universe, silence had been his only companion, save for the quiet, constant presence of Major. Jack's world had shrunk to the confines of his beat-up Ford F-150, a rolling coffin filled with the ghosts of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. In that cramped space were the remnants of Sergeant First Class Jack Miller, Delta Force, retired. A man who had once navigated the world's most dangerous terrains with preternatural calm was now lost in the wilderness of his own grief. The medals were in a box somewhere, tarnished. The commendations were filed away. The skills, the discipline, the very essence of the man he was, were buried under an avalanche of loss. The loss of Sarah. Her name was a wound, a raw, gaping chasm in his soul. The official report called it a single-car accident on a rain-slicked coastal road. A tragedy, an act of God. But to Jack, it felt like an execution. It was too neat, too sudden, too absolute. But in the fog of his sorrow, the questions had no shape, and he had no strength to form them. So he ran. He drove until the cities blurred into towns and the towns into desolate stretches of highway, the odometer tracking the miles he put between himself and the home that was no longer a home. Major was the only reason the truck kept moving, the only reason Jack remembered to eat, to breathe. The dog, a parting gift from Sarah a year before she died. So you'll always have a sergeant to keep you in line, she teased, was his anchor to the living world. The shepherd's internal clock was a merciless drill instructor, demanding walks, food, and attention with a wet nose and a patient paw, pulling Jack back from the edge every single day. It was Major who had led him here, to this brackish purgatory in the armpit of the Pacific Northwest. During a pre-dawn walk along a deserted beach, the dog had caught a scent on the wind. With a low whine, he'd broken into a trot, pulling a reluctant Jack off the sand and through a rusted, chain-link fence. They had entered a graveyard of marine vessels, a place where ships came to die, and there Major had stopped. His body went rigid, his tail straight, his entire being focused on one vessel, a decrepit, rust-streaked car ferry named the Sea Serpent. It was a monstrosity of decay, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, its decks sagging, its windows shattered like vacant eyes. Any other dog would have been interested in the rats scurrying along the pier. Any other man would have seen nothing but a tetanus hazard. But Major was transfixed. He paced at the water's edge, whining, looking from the ferry back to Jack, his intelligent eyes burning with an urgency Jack hadn't seen since their days training in the field. He refused to leave. For 2 days, the dog held his vigil, forcing Jack to remain, to stare at the monument of ruin. On the 3rd morning, as Jack sat slumped against a piling, the familiar, cold numbness creeping into his bones, Major did something new. He walked over, nudged Jack's hand, and then let out a single, sharp bark, a sound that cut through the silence like a command. Then he turned and stared at the ferry. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Engage the target. A flicker of the old soldier stirred in Jack's chest. For the first time in months, a feeling other than grief registered, curiosity. He looked at the dog, then at the ferry, a forgotten relic in a forgotten port. A strange, irrational sense of purpose began to coalesce in the void. He had nothing left to lose, nowhere else to go. With a sigh that seemed to empty his lungs of all the stale air he'd been breathing for half a year, he pushed himself to his feet. "All right, Major," he rasped, his voice hoarse from disuse. "All right, let's go see about your ship." The shipyard owner was a gnarled man named Silas, with hands like driftwood and eyes that had seen 1,000 tides come and go. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Jack's worn-out boots when Jack made his inquiry. "The Serpent," Silas cackled, a dry, rattling sound. "Son, you don't want that thing. She's been rotting there for 20 years. The hull's paper-thin. She's a ghost. Good for nothing but scrap." Jack just nodded, his gaze fixed on the ferry where Major was already waiting, as if he owned the place. "How much for the scrap?" he asked. Silas squinted, sizing up the haunted look in Jack's eyes, the military-grade dog at his side, and the threadbare state of his clothes. He saw a man at the end of his rope, chasing a foolish whim. He named a price that was insultingly low for a vessel of that size but astronomically high for a man living out of his truck. It was the exact amount Jack had left from his final disability check and the meager savings he hadn't yet drunk away. It was everything. Without hesitation, Jack pulled a crumpled roll of bills from his pocket. "I'll take it." Silas stared at the money, then back at Jack, his amusement turning to a flicker of pity. "Your funeral, pal." He scribbled out a bill of sale on a greasy notepad. "She's all yours. Lock, stock, and rust bucket." That afternoon, Jack drove his truck onto the creaking deck of the Sea Serpent. The groan of the corroded metal under the weight of the vehicle sounded like a moan from the grave. This was it. This was his new home, a floating tomb. The first few weeks were a descent into a special kind of hell. The ferry was a labyrinth of decay. Every surface was coated in a patina of rust, grime, and bird droppings. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water, mold, and profound neglect. Jack's mission, at first, was simply survival. He cleared a small space in what was once the passenger lounge, sweeping away shattered glass and debris. He patched a section of the roof with a tarp to keep the persistent drizzle out. He ran a single extension cord from a utility pole Silas grudgingly allowed him to use, giving him one working light bulb and the ability to charge his phone. He and Major lived on military rations and cheap kibble. The sheer scale of the dereliction was overwhelming, a physical manifestation of the ruin inside him. More than once, Jack found himself sitting in the dark, the single bulb switched off, a cheap bottle of whiskey in his hand, ready to let the tide of despair pull him under for good. But every time, Major would intervene. The dog would rest his heavy head on Jack's knee, his warm brown eyes reflecting a deep, unwavering faith. He would nudge the bottle away with his snout and then whine, a low, mournful sound that was impossible to ignore. Then, he would get up and walk pointedly toward a section of the ship, looking back as if to say, "Not here. Over here. This is where the work is." The dog seemed to have a map of the ferry in his mind, a purpose that Jack could only blindly follow. It was Major who led him to the captain's quarters. The room was a disaster, its contents pulped by years of water damage. But the dog ignored the debris, focusing his attention on one specific wall panel beneath a shattered porthole. He began to paw at it, first gently, then with an obsessive, frantic energy, his claws scraping against the rotted wood. He would dig for a minute, then look back at Jack, a sharp bark punctuating his plea. Finally, to appease the dog, Jack grabbed a pry bar. The wood splintered easily, revealing the steel bulkhead behind it. And there, almost invisible against the corroded metal, was the clean, precise line of a weld. It was a patch no bigger than a shoebox, and it was not original to the ship's construction. A cold thrill, the first of its kind in a long time, shot through Jack. His instincts, dormant for so long, flared to life. Someone had hidden something here. Carefully, using a grinder he'd bought with his last few dollars, he began to work on the weld, sparks showering the dark cabin. Major sat at his feet, panting softly, his work as a guide momentarily complete. He had brought the man to the door. Now it was up to the man to find the key. The grinder whined, a high-pitched scream against the decades of silence. Jack worked with the meticulous patience of a bomb disposal expert, his hands steady, his focus absolute. He wasn't just cutting through steel, he was cutting through the fog of his own inertia. The smell of hot metal filled the small cabin, a clean, sharp scent that momentarily overpowered the stench of decay. After an hour of painstaking effort, the welded seal gave way. Jack pried the small steel plate off the bulkhead, revealing a dark cavity. Reaching inside, his fingers brushed against cold, oilskin-wrapped canvas. He pulled it out. It was a heavy, rectangular package, bound tightly with wax twine. He set it on the dusty chart table, the single bare bulb overhead casting long, dancing shadows. Major rested his chin on the edge of the table, his tail giving a single, expectant thump against a rusty cabinet. With his service knife, Jack sliced the twine and carefully unfolded the canvas. Inside lay two items: a thick, leather-bound journal, its cover stamped with the faded image of a serpent eating its own tail, and a roll of schematics, drawn with drafting pen precision on vellum that had yellowed with age. A faint, musty smell of paper and ink rose from the package, the scent of a story locked away from the world. He opened the journal. The first page was a simple inscription: the log of Arthur Vance. A VC serpent. The handwriting was an elegant, slightly archaic cursive, but the entries themselves were not in plain English. They were written in a complex cipher, a series of numbers and symbols that would be meaningless to an untrained eye. But Jack's eye was not untrained. He stared at the page, and a forgotten part of his brain came online. It was a variation of a rolling key cipher used by resistance cells in World War II, a system he'd studied and even modified for his own unit's use in the field. It was designed to be unbreakable without the key, which was typically a passage from a specific book. A cold dread mixed with excitement washed over him. This wasn't a simple diary. This was a secret, deliberately and expertly concealed. For the next 3 days, Jack was a man possessed. He barely ate or slept. The ferry, the world, his own grief. It all faded into the background. His entire being was focused on the puzzle. He searched the cabin for the key. He ran his hands over every book, every scrap of paper, but everything was too waterlogged to be legible. The key wasn't here. Frustrated, he stood and paced the small room, his mind racing through cryptographic possibilities. Major watched him, head cocked. Then the dog padded over to a small, built-in bookshelf, nudged a single, salt-encrusted volume with his nose, and looked back at Jack. It was a copy of Moby Dick, its cover swollen and stiff. It seemed as ruined as the rest, but when Jack pulled it from the shelf, it felt different. Heavier. He forced the cover open, and a section of the pulped pages fell away, revealing a hollowed-out compartment. Tucked inside was a small, brass key and a single, laminated card. On the card was one sentence: Chapter 36, The Quarter Deck. It was the key. With trembling hands, Jack returned to the journal. Using the text from the designated chapter of his own pocket copy of the novel, he began the laborious process of decryption. Letter by letter, word by word, a story emerged from the jumble of numbers. It was the voice of Arthur Vance, a brilliant, passionate, and deeply paranoid marine engineer. Vance, the ferry's original owner and designer in the late 1970s, wrote not of passenger logs or shipping manifests, but of a revolutionary invention he was building in secret within the ship's very hull. He called it the tidal heart. According to his notes, it was a system of submerged turbines and pressure converters that could generate staggering amounts of clean electricity from simple tidal flux, far more efficiently than any existing technology. He believed it was the future, a source of limitless, free energy for the world. But his later entries grew dark. He wrote of corporate spies from a major energy conglomerate, of sabotage to his work, of threats against his family. He mentioned a ruthless young executive who was determined to steal his research. Vance was convinced they wouldn't just steal his work. They would bury him and his legacy to protect their own oil-based profits. His final entries were frantic. He was hiding the core of his research, the final patentable designs and the prototype's control module, somewhere on the Sea Serpent. "They can have my reputation," he wrote in the last deciphered entry. dated the day the ferry was mysteriously taken out of service for safety violations. They can take my ship, but they will not take my soul. The serpent will guard my heart until someone worthy comes to claim it. Jack sat back. The decoded pages spread before him. The schematics on the table suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. They weren't for the ferry's main engine. They were for the tidal heart. He was sitting on top of a world-changing invention. Arthur Vance's story resonated in the hollow chambers of Jack's own heart. A good man betrayed. A legacy stolen. A fight unfinished. For the first time since Sarah's death, Jack felt a purpose that was not his own. A mission handed to him across the decades. He looked over at Major, who was now peacefully asleep, his duty done. The dog hadn't just found a boat. He had found a cause. And in doing so, he had given one back to his broken master. The restoration of the sea serpent was no longer a whim. It was a sacred duty. The journal became Jack's Bible, the schematics his guide. Arthur Vance's ghost was now his constant companion. His voice a whisper in the creaking of the ship's hull. His ambition a blueprint for Jack's own salvation. The work was no longer about just creating a habitable space. It was about honoring a legacy. It was an act of resurrection. He began in the engine room, a cavernous space of rust and ruin that Vance had called his cathedral. It was a metal jungle of seized pistons, corroded pipes, and dead machinery. For weeks, Jack's life was a rhythm of physical toil. He spent his days scraping, grinding, and sanding, the screech of metal on metal a constant chorus. The rust fell away in red clouds, coating him in a fine powder that caked his skin and clothes. He felt like he was physically scraping away the layers of his own corrosive grief. Each patch of clean, bare steel a small victory against the decay that had consumed both the ship and his spirit. He used his military disability payments, now his only source of income, to buy tools, solvents, and primers. He learned to weld with a focus he hadn't felt since he was learning to dismantle a foreign rifle in the dark. Each bead he laid, joining two pieces of broken metal, felt like he was mending a piece of himself, stitching his fractured psyche back together. He followed Vance's schematics, tracing the lines of the forgotten tidal heart system. He found where the primary conduits were meant to run, where the prototype's housing had been hastily removed, leaving behind telltale scars on the bulkhead. He wasn't just repairing a ferry. He was conducting an archaeological dig, uncovering the ghost of a revolutionary machine. The physical labor was grueling, but it was honest. It left him exhausted, his muscles aching, but his mind was, for the first time in a long time, quiet. The nightmares of Sarah's mangled car, which had haunted his sleep for months, began to recede. They were replaced by dreams of gears turning and engines firing, of the sea serpent cutting cleanly through the water, reborn. His solitude was broken by necessity. He ran out of welding gas and needed specific marine-grade parts he couldn't order online. This forced him into the small, coastal town of Port Blossom, a place he had so far avoided. The town's main street was a quiet affair, a collection of historic storefronts that seemed to sag with the weight of time. He found what he was looking for at Elias and Son Hardware, a shop that smelled of sawdust, oil, and history. The owner, Elias, was a man in his late 70s, with kind, crinkling eyes and hands stained with a lifetime of work. He listened patiently as Jack, hesitant and unused to conversation, described the parts he needed. For the old serpent, Elias said, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Haven't heard that name in a long time. My father helped build the docks she used to sail from. Elias didn't ask why Jack was trying to resurrect a ghost ship. He didn't pry into the sadness that clung to him like the shipyard mud. He simply led Jack to the back of the store, to dusty shelves filled with forgotten stock. Arthur Vance was a good man, Elias said quietly, as he wiped the dust off a bronze valve fitting. A dreamer. The town thought he was crazy, but he had a fire in him. Said that Ferry was more than just a ferry. A damn shame what happened. This small act of connection, of shared history, was a balm to Jack's isolated soul. He became a regular at the hardware store. Elias would set aside parts for him, offer quiet advice, and sometimes just share a coffee with him at the counter. He was the first person to treat Jack not as a vagrant or a lost cause, but simply as a man with a project. He was a bridge back to the world. Slowly, miraculously, the sea serpent began to transform. A section of the hull above the waterline was sanded down to bare metal, primed, and painted a deep nautical blue. Jack restored the ship's generator, and one evening, the ferry's navigation lights flickered to life, casting a steady, defiant glow across the dark water of the shipyard. He rewired the captain's quarters, turning the ruined space into a Spartan but clean and warm home. He built a small galley kitchen. He and Major no longer ate cold rations but hot meals, cooked on a stove he had salvaged and repaired. The progress was a testament to his relentless work, a mirror of his own internal healing. He was no longer a man adrift. He was a man with a purpose, a home, and a mission. He was the keeper of Arthur Vance's legacy and the steward of the sea serpent. He didn't know it yet, but his quiet resurrection project had not gone unnoticed. In a high-rise office hundreds of miles away, an algorithm flagged a series of unusual purchases. Large quantities of marine primer, welding supplies, and specific engine parts, all delivered to a defunct shipyard. For the first time in 20 years, someone was paying attention to the ghost ship. And that someone had a great deal to lose if its secrets were ever brought to light. The sleek, black sedan seemed to absorb the light, a slash of expensive darkness against the shipyard's muted palette of gray and brown. It rolled to a stop on the gravel near the pier, and a man in a suit that cost more than Jack's truck emerged. He was tall, with silvered hair and a smile that was perfectly white and utterly cold. He moved with the predatory grace of a shark, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the gravel as he approached the gangplank of the sea serpent. "Quite the project you've got here," the man said, his voice as smooth and polished as the car he'd stepped out of. He extended a hand. "Marcus Caldwell. I'm a developer. We're in the process of acquiring this whole waterfront for a new luxury marina project." Jack didn't take the offered hand. He remained where he was, halfway up a ladder, a paint scraper in his grasp. Major, who had been dozing in a patch of sun, rose to his feet, a low, almost inaudible growl vibrating in his chest. The dog's hackles were raised. Jack's internal alarms, honed by years of threat assessment, were screaming. He'd seen men like Caldwell before, men who used charm as a weapon and whose smiles never reached their eyes. "It's not for sale," Jack said, his voice flat. Caldwell's smile widened, but the coldness in his eyes intensified. "Oh, I think you misunderstand. This isn't a negotiation about market value. Frankly, this vessel is an eyesore and a liability. According to the Port Authority, it's scheduled for demolition. I'm here to do you a favor. I can offer you a modest sum for the scrap rights, save you the trouble and put a little cash in your pocket. Enough to get you a fresh start somewhere else." The offer was slick with condescension. Caldwell's gaze flickered over Jack's worn clothes and the ferry's half-restored state, dismissing him as a squatter, a nobody. He saw the rust, not the restoration. He saw a problem to be removed, not a legacy to be honored. "I have the bill of sale," Jack stated calmly, descending the ladder. "She's my property, and I'm not selling." He placed himself between Caldwell and the gangplank, a quiet, immovable object. Major moved to his side, no longer growling but poised, a silent and potent threat. For a fleeting second, Caldwell's mask of affable charm slipped. A flash of pure, undiluted fury crossed his face. It was the look of a king whose decree had been ignored by a peasant. He was not used to being told no. He quickly composed himself, his smile returning, but it was thinner now, brittle. "A man of principle," Caldwell said, his tone dripping with mock admiration. "I can respect that, but principles don't pay the bills, and they don't stop eminent domain. Think about it. My offer stands for 48 hours. He turned and walked back to his car, his posture rigid with indignation. As the black sedan pulled away, kicking up a cloud of dust, Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. He hadn't just refused a business offer. He had defied a threat. He looked at the half-painted hull, at the lights he had so painstakingly rewired. This wasn't just a ship anymore. It was his sanctuary, his fortress. And he had just been put on notice that it was under siege. The encounter left a residue of unease that clung to the air long after Caldwell's car had disappeared. Jack knew, with the certainty of a soldier who has looked into the eyes of his enemy, that this was not over. The 48 hours passed in a tense, watchful silence. Jack worked with a renewed urgency, but his senses were on high alert. He found himself scanning the perimeter of the shipyard, noting the access points, the blind spots. The instincts he had tried so hard to bury were re-emerging, not as sources of trauma, but as tools for survival. The first attack was subtle. A large shipment of custom-cut steel plates he had ordered from a specialty fabricator, paid for with nearly all of his remaining funds, never arrived. The company claimed it had been delivered. The shipping service had a signature, but it was an illegible scrawl. The plates were simply gone. A few nights later, the single extension cord that provided his power was cleanly severed. He woke to a profound darkness and the silence of a dead generator. The food in his small refrigerator slowly beginning to spoil. These were not random acts of vandalism. They were calculated moves, designed to bleed him dry, to make his life on the ferry untenable. They were messages from Caldwell. The threats turned personal a week later. Jack returned from a supply run in town to find a notice plastered to the ferry's gangplank. It was an official-looking document from the county, declaring the sea serpent an environmental hazard and a public nuisance, subject to immediate seizure and disposal if not brought up to an impossible list of modern codes within 30 days. Jack's heart sank. He knew this was Caldwell's doing, the flexing of a corrupt muscle. He was being squeezed, legally and logistically. That evening, as a storm began to brew offshore, Caldwell returned. This time, he didn't bother with the pretense of a suit. He wore a heavy jacket and an expression of grim finality. He wasn't accompanied by lawyers, but by two large, thuggish men who stood by his car like gargoyles. "I see you got my message," Caldwell said, gesturing to the notice. "Your time is up. I am the final authority here. This town, this council, they understand progress. I'm making you one last offer, out of the goodness of my heart. Double what I said before. Take it and walk away, or I will have this rust bucket crushed into a cube with you inside it if I have to." Jack stood his ground at the top of the gangplank. The wind whipped his hair, and the first drops of rain began to fall. He was no longer just a grieving widower. He was the defender of Arthur Vance's dream, and in a way he was only just beginning to understand. He was defending Sarah, too. "The answer is still no," Jack said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the rising wind. Caldwell laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You're a fool. A broken-down soldier playing captain of a ghost ship. You have nothing. I have everything. You can't win. Get off my property," Jack ordered. Caldwell's face hardened into a mask of contempt. "This will be your last mistake," he snarled, before turning and striding back to his car. The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. As the taillights vanished into the stormy twilight, Jack knew the game had changed. Caldwell wasn't just trying to scare him off anymore. He was coming for the ferry, and he would stop at nothing to get it. A cold, hard resolve settled in Jack's gut. The fear was gone, replaced by a familiar, icy calm. He had been pushed, and now he would push back. He looked over at Major, who stood beside him, a steadfast shadow against the darkening sky. The dog let out a low growl, not of aggression, but of readiness. The soldier and his sentinel were preparing for battle. The time for restoration was over. The time for fortification had begun. The escalating threats lit a fire under Jack. Caldwell's ruthlessness was a key, unlocking a part of Arthur Vance's journal he had previously dismissed as paranoia. Vance had written about a final, desperate measure he'd taken to protect the heart of his work from the corporate wolf who hunted him. "If they take my ship," the entry read, "they will find an empty cathedral. The soul of my work is not in the engine room. I have given it back to the sea, to be protected by the serpent's belly, Safe beneath the tide, the serpent's belly. The bilge. A place no one would willingly go. Driven by a desperate new urgency, Jack suited up. He pulled on a wetsuit he'd bought for hull inspections and a scuba mask, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and hope. The bilge was a dark, flooded maze of freezing, oily water and treacherous, submerged machinery. With a powerful underwater flashlight and a line tied to his waist, he lowered himself into the blackness. The beam of his light cut a lonely path through the murky water. It was a claustrophobic nightmare, a liquid tomb. He navigated by feel, his hands tracing the cold steel of the ferry's internal skeleton. He followed the path laid out in a half-forgotten schematic. A secondary plan Vance had labeled contingency. After nearly an hour in the frigid water, his fingers brushed against something that wasn't part of the ship's structure. A rectangular container, bolted to the keel itself. It was made of marine-grade stainless steel and sealed with heavy-duty latches. It took him another 30 minutes of wrestling with corroded bolts in the crushing dark, his lungs burning, but he finally freed it. He hauled the heavy container back to the engine room, his body shaking from cold and adrenaline. He pried open the latches. Inside, perfectly preserved in a vacuum-sealed bag, was another ledger, a set of notarized patent documents, and a small stack of photographs. The ledger was Vance's ace in the hole. It meticulously detailed every act of corporate espionage, every instance of sabotage with dates, times, and names. It was a damning chronicle of a conspiracy. And the name of the corporate wolf, the young, ambitious executive who orchestrated it all, was written in clear, angry script, Marcus Caldwell. But it was the photograph on top that stopped Jack's heart. It was a faded color snapshot from the early 1980s. A proud, smiling Arthur Vance stood on the deck of the Sea Serpent, his arm around his daughter. And holding his other hand was a little girl with bright, curious eyes and a familiar, mischievous smile. A little girl with a gap in her front teeth. It was Sarah. His Sarah. The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from Jack's lungs. Arthur Vance was Sarah's grandfather. The pieces of Jack's shattered life slammed together with brutal, horrifying clarity. Sarah's last trip. She hadn't been on a vacation. She had come here to Port Blossom, the town her mother had left behind. Her family had always spoken of her grandfather as a brilliant but tragic figure who had lost everything. Sarah, with her innate sense of justice and her love for a good puzzle, must have started digging. She must have found something, a clue, a local who remembered, something that put her on the path to the truth. Her accident was no accident. It was a silencing. Caldwell hadn't just stolen an invention 20 years ago. He had built his entire empire, his vast fortune, on that theft. And when Sarah got too close to exposing him, he had her killed. The grief Jack had been running from, the trauma that had broken him, was no longer a random tragedy. It had a face. It had a name. It had a source. And that source was Marcus Caldwell. The $200 million secret wasn't just about a patent. It was the motive for his wife's murder. The stakes were no longer about honoring a dead inventor's legacy. They were about getting justice for the woman he loved. A wave of ice-cold fury washed over Jack, extinguishing the last embers of his despair. The broken veteran was gone. In his place stood Sergeant First Class Jack Miller. And he had a new mission. The transformation was absolute. The grief that had been a suffocating fog became a lens, focusing Jack's entire being into a single, sharp point. Justice. For Sarah. For Arthur Vance. The ferry, his sanctuary, and his project now became his weapon. The restorer became a tactician. The broken man became an operator. He spread the schematics for the Sea Serpent across the large chart table. Not just Vance's plans for the tidal heart, but the original blueprints he'd found in a rusted filing cabinet. He studied them not as an engineer, but as a soldier preparing a battlefield. He knew every corridor, every hatch, every hidden space. He had touched every surface, mended every weakness. The ship was an extension of his own body. His enemy was a wealthy, arrogant man who would hire thugs to do his dirty work. Caldwell would be expecting to storm a derelict ship and intimidate a broken man. He would not be expecting a fortified kill zone commanded by a Delta Force veteran. Jack worked with a chilling efficiency. The restoration work now had a dual purpose. The new electrical system he'd installed was rerouted through a central control panel he built in the engine room. With the flip of a few switches, he could plunge sections of the ship into darkness while keeping others lit. He could overload circuits to create blinding flashes, turning junction boxes into makeshift flashbangs. The heavy cargo nets he'd found in the hold were repaired and rigged to drop from the ceilings in the main vehicle bay. He reactivated a section of the old fire suppression system in a narrow corridor, but instead of water, he calibrated it to release a disorienting blast of high-pressure steam from the boiler he had so carefully repaired. The engine room, Arthur Vance's cathedral, became Jack's command center and final redoubt. The heavy, newly functional machinery, the catwalks, the deep shadows, it was perfect terrain for a final stand. He knew Caldwell would come for the ledger and the patent. The man's entire life was built on that lie. He wouldn't trust anyone else with the final retrieval. Jack took a burner phone he kept for emergencies and made a single, anonymous call to Caldwell's office. "I know what you did to Arthur Vance," he said in a disguised voice. "And I have the proof. The ledger, the patents, everything. If you want it back, come to the Serpent. Come alone." Tonight he knew Caldwell wouldn't come alone, but the personal challenge would ensure that Caldwell himself would be there. The bait was set. As dusk fell, the storm that had been brewing offshore finally broke. Rain lashed against the ferry in horizontal sheets, and the wind howled through the shipyard, a symphony of rage that matched the tempest in Jack's soul. He moved through his ship, checking his preparations, a silent predator in his own domain. He stopped in his small, neat cabin and looked at the one photograph he kept on his nightstand. A picture of him and Sarah, smiling on a hiking trip. He touched her face on the cool glass. "This is for you," he whispered. He then knelt down and looked Major in the eyes. The dog had been watching him, sensing the shift from restorer to warrior. "Okay, boy," Jack said softly, scratching behind his ears. "You know the plan. Silent. Hidden. Wait for my command." And only my command. Major gave a soft whine and licked his hand, a silent oath of loyalty. Jack positioned the dog in a dark alcove above the engine room, a spot that gave him a perfect vantage point but kept him completely concealed. The trap was ready. The soldier was in position, and the hunt was about to begin. The storm was a wall of noise and water, a perfect cover for an assault. Through a pair of night vision binoculars, Jack saw the headlights cut through the rain. It wasn't Caldwell's sleek sedan, but a heavy-duty work van. It stopped where Caldwell's car had before. 3 figures emerged, clad in dark rain gear. 2 were the large, brutish men from before. The third, even in the gloom, was unmistakably Caldwell, his face a mask of grim determination. They were armed with crowbars and heavy flashlights. They moved toward the gangplank, arrogant and assured. Jack retreated from his observation post on the bridge into the belly of the ship, melting into the shadows. The ferry was pitch black, silent save for the drumming of the rain and the groaning of the hull against the pier. The 3 men boarded, their powerful flashlight beams cutting sharp, nervous triangles into the darkness of the main vehicle bay. "Find him," Caldwell ordered, his voice tight with anger. "And find the damn box." The 2 thugs split up, moving deeper into the cavernous space. This was their first mistake. As the first thug passed under a designated point, Jack, hidden on a catwalk above, pulled a rope. A 50-pound block of salvaged engine parts, wrapped in canvas, swung down like a pendulum, catching the man squarely in the chest and knocking him unconscious into a pool of grimy water. The second thug heard the splash and spun around, his flashlight beam wildly searching the darkness. "What was that?" he yelled. From his control panel in the engine room, Jack flipped a switch. A series of powerful strobe lights, repurposed from the ferry's old emergency system, erupted in the thug's face, blinding and disorienting him. Before the man could recover, Jack dropped the heavy cargo net. It fell perfectly, enveloping him in a tangle of thick rope. He thrashed for a moment before giving up, hopelessly ensnared. Two down. Caldwell, hearing the commotion, drew a pistol from under his jacket, his confidence evaporating into raw fear. "Miller!" he screamed into the darkness, his voice echoing off the steel walls. "Show yourself. This is between you and me." Jack let the silence answer for a moment. Then, he used the ship's old PA system, his voice calm and disembodied, coming from all directions at once. "You're in my world now, Caldwell." He cut the lights in the vehicle bay and illuminated a single path leading toward the engine room. He was hurting him. Panicked, Caldwell followed the light, the promise of a confrontation better than being hunted in the dark. He stumbled into the engine room, a vast, multi-leveled space of shadows and machinery. "All right, Miller. No more games," he shouted, waving his gun. Jack was waiting on a narrow catwalk high above him. "It was never a game, Caldwell," Jack said, his voice now clear and close. Caldwell spun and fired wildly upwards, the shots ricocheting harmlessly off the heavy steel. Jack was already gone, dropping down a ladder on the far side of the room. He led Caldwell on a chase through the metallic maze, using the environment he knew so intimately. He triggered a deafening blast from the ship's horn, making Caldwell flinch and giving Jack time to reposition. He was a ghost, always one step ahead. The final confrontation happened on the main floor, between the hulks of the two giant diesel engines. Jack emerged from the shadows, unarmed. "It's over," he said. Caldwell, enraged and cornered, lunged at him. But he had underestimated the man he was facing. Jack met his charge, using his momentum against him. A swift, precise series of movements, a block, a joint lock, a throw, sent Caldwell crashing to the steel deck, the gun skittering away. But Caldwell was slippery. As Jack moved to secure him, the man grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby workbench and swung it wildly, catching Jack in the ribs. The pain was sharp, electric, stealing Jack's breath. He staggered back, and in that split second, Caldwell scrambled for the gun. He got it. He rose to his feet, a triumphant, demonic grin on his face as he leveled the pistol at Jack's head. "I told you," Caldwell hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You should have taken the money." In that frozen moment, as Jack stared down the barrel of his own death, a black and tan missile launched from the darkness of the catwalks above. There was no bark, no warning, only the sound of 75 pounds of pure loyalty and muscle hitting Caldwell's back. Major, acting on instinct and the sight of his master in mortal danger, had broken his command to wait. The impact sent Caldwell sprawling forward. The gun fired, the shot going wild, echoing like a thunderclap through the engine room. Before Caldwell could react, Major had his teeth locked onto the man's gun arm, his growl a terrifying sound of controlled fury. He wasn't mauling. He was neutralizing, his training and instincts in perfect sync. The gun clattered to the floor. Jack surged forward, kicking the weapon away and finally subduing the disarmed and defeated Caldwell just as the wail of approaching sirens grew louder. Elias, the hardware store owner, had heard the gunshot echo across the water and had done the right thing. Jack stood over the man who had murdered his wife, breathing heavily, the pain in his ribs sharp. He looked at Major, who still held Caldwell's arm firmly, waiting for the command to release. The dog's eyes were fixed on Jack, loyal to the very end. The battle for the Sea Serpent was over. The arrival of the police turned the chaotic engine room into a sterile crime scene. Caldwell, his face a mixture of disbelief and impotent rage, was cuffed and led away, Major releasing his arm only on Jack's firm command. The two thugs were rounded up. The ledger, the patent documents, and Caldwell's gun were all bagged as evidence. The case was airtight. The story that unfolded became a national sensation. The homeless veteran, the ghost ship, the brilliant, forgotten inventor, and the corrupt billionaire CEO whose empire was built on theft and murder. It was a modern-day epic. Marcus Caldwell was exposed not as a captain of industry, but as a common thief and a killer. The investigation into Sarah's death was reopened, and with the evidence from Vance's ledger and Caldwell's confession under pressure, the truth was finally, officially acknowledged. She had been murdered. The courts moved swiftly. As Sarah's surviving spouse and the legal owner of the property where Arthur Vance's final documents were discovered, Jack was declared the sole heir to the title heart patent. Financial experts, valuing the technology in the burgeoning green energy market, estimated its worth at well over $200 million. But the money was never the point. It was a tool, a means to an end. Jack's first act was to honor the man who had started it all. He hired the best marine architects and shipwrights in the country, and with his newfound resources, he completed the restoration of the sea serpent. It was a magnificent resurrection. The hull gleamed a majestic ocean blue, the brass fittings shone like gold, and the wooden decks were restored to their original luster. The main engine room was preserved as it was, a museum to Vance's genius, with the title heart schematics displayed like priceless works of art. The Ferry, once a symbol of decay and loss, became a beloved local landmark and a floating monument to innovation and perseverance. But Jack's true mission lay beyond the ship. He established the Sarah Miller Foundation, a nonprofit with a dual purpose that brought his entire journey full circle. One half of the foundation was dedicated to providing housing, therapy, and vocational training for veterans struggling with trauma and homelessness, ensuring that men and women like him would never have to fall through the cracks. The other half provided grants to independent, ethical inventors and scientists, the modern-day Arthur Vance, so their world-changing ideas would not be stolen or buried by corporate greed. He had found his peace, not by escaping his past, but by confronting it head-on. The wound of Sarah's loss would never fully disappear, but it was no longer a source of consuming darkness. It was now a wellspring of purpose, a guiding light for the good he was putting into the world. On a calm, sunny afternoon, Jack stood on the bridge of the fully restored sea serpent, his hand resting on the polished wood of the ship's wheel. The vessel was moored permanently at a new dock, a beacon of hope for the entire town of Port Blossom. Beside him, as always, was Major, his fur shining in the sun, his head resting gently against Jack's leg. They looked out at the calm, blue water, the silence between them comfortable and complete. They had faced the storm and sailed through it. They had turned a rusted tomb into a legacy, and in doing so had rebuilt a life one piece of steel, one act of loyalty, one memory of love at a time. This story is a powerful reminder that even from the deepest depths of loss and decay, new life and purpose can be forged. It shows that true loyalty, like that of a faithful dog, can be the catalyst that pulls us from the brink, guiding us toward the work our soul needs to do. Jack and Major didn't just restore a ferry. They resurrected a legacy and, in the process, healed a man's broken spirit, proving that sometimes the best way to mend our own hearts is by rebuilding something meant for others. The rusted shell of the sea serpent became a vessel for justice, and ultimately, a beacon of hope, demonstrating that our deepest wounds can become the source of our greatest strength. We are so grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. What did you think of Jack and Major's journey? Please let us know in the comments below. Your feedback and engagement are what keep our channel going. If you enjoyed the story, please consider giving it a like and sharing it with someone who might also appreciate it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. Thank you again for your incredible support. We'll see you in